I will burn this pathetic little diner straight to the ground with you inside." 3 local thugs had just terrorized an elderly couple for extortion money, completely ignoring the quiet stranger sitting in the back corner booth. He looked like just a tired drifter sipping black coffee. His German shepherd rested silently under the table. When the gang leader raised his heavy fist to strike the frail old man, he thought he owned the room. He did not know the quiet stranger was an active-duty Navy SEAL, and he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. This story is about to take a turn nobody expected. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments which country you are watching from, and if you love stories that melt your heart, please subscribe to support our channel. The afternoon sun baked the cracked asphalt outside an old family diner in rural Texas. Heat waves shimmered above the empty road. Inside, the ceiling fans spun slowly, cutting through the warm air that smelled of fried bacon and strong coffee. The bell above the front door jingled. Aiden stepped inside. He was a tall man with broad shoulders, wearing faded denim jeans and a plain black shirt that clung to his athletic frame. His posture was straight and rigid, a clear sign of his active military background. His eyes scanned the room instantly, checking the exits, noting the windows, and counting the occupants with practiced precision. Walking right beside his left leg was Coda. Coda was a large German shepherd with a thick coat of black and tan fur. The dog did not pull on the leash. He moved with perfect discipline, stopping exactly when Aiden stopped. Aiden chose a booth in the far back corner. It offered a clear view of the front door and the entire dining area. He sat down facing the entrance. He pointed a finger at the floor beneath the table. Coda immediately crawled underneath and lay down, resting his chin on his paws. The dog made no sound. Behind the counter stood the owners of the diner. Thomas was an elderly man in his late 70s. He wore a faded blue apron and had a slight limp when he walked. His hands showed the rough texture of a lifetime of hard labor, yet he moved with a quiet dignity as he wiped down the counter. Beside him was his wife, Martha. She looked equally tired, but wore a warm, gentle smile. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and she hummed a soft tune while pouring fresh coffee into a glass pot. The diner was mostly empty. A few locals sat at the front booths, quietly finishing their afternoon meals. Aiden watched Thomas and Martha work. He noticed how Thomas favored his left leg, putting his weight on the right. He noticed how Martha placed a loving hand on her husband's lower back every time she squeezed past him in the narrow kitchen space. They moved together like clockwork, perfectly in sync after decades of marriage. Martha picked up a laminated menu and walked over to Aiden. She wiped her hands on her apron and smiled kindly. "Welcome in, sir. What can I get for you today?" Aiden looked up, his expression serious but respectful. "Just a black coffee, please. Thank you, ma'am." Martha noticed the large dog resting quietly under the table. "Oh, what a handsome boy. Does he need a bowl of water? It is terribly hot outside." "A bowl of water would be great. He is well behaved. He will not cause any trouble," Aiden said. His voice was deep and calm. "I can see that," Martha replied, heading back to the counter to fetch his order. Aiden returned to his silent observation. He did not check his phone. He did not read the newspaper left on the table. He simply sat and watched the room. In a world full of noise and constant motion, there is a distinct power in absolute stillness. And sometimes the quietest presence in a room is the one carrying the heaviest burden. Aiden possessed that kind of stillness. Martha brought the steaming coffee and a metal bowl of cool water. Aiden placed the bowl near Coda. The dog drank quietly, never taking his watchful eyes off the front door. Minutes ticked by. The last few customers paid their bills, tipped their hats to Thomas, and left. Thomas locked the cash register and sighed, leaning heavily against the counter. Martha poured herself a small cup of tea and stood beside him. They spoke in hushed voices, sharing the quiet moments of the afternoon. The diner fell into a peaceful lull. The only sounds were the ticking of the wall clock and the low hum of the kitchen refrigerator. Then the peace shattered completely. The bell above the door did not just jingle. It clattered violently against the glass as the front door was kicked open. 3 men walked into the diner. They brought the sweltering Texas heat in with them, along with an immediate sense of danger. The man in the front was Brody. He was in his early 30s, heavy, wearing a dirty tank top that revealed thick arms covered in faded tattoos. He wore heavy leather boots that stomped loudly on the clean checkered floor. 2 younger men followed close behind him. They had the same arrogant expressions, looking around the room like they owned the place. Brody slammed his heavy hand on the front counter. The sound echoed sharply in the quiet room, rattling the glass pie display case. Martha jumped, spilling a few drops of her hot tea onto the floor. Thomas immediately stepped in front of his wife, shielding her with his frail body. He gripped the edge of the counter to steady himself. "Afternoon, Thomas," Brody said. His voice carried a cruel, mocking tone. He leaned over the counter, invading the old man's personal space. "Looks like business is slow today. I hope you still have our monthly contribution ready. You know how much we care about the safety of this nice little place." Thomas swallowed hard, his worn hands trembling slightly. "Brody, please. You know we barely made rent this week." Aiden did not flinch, his hand wrapped loosely around his thick ceramic coffee mug. He took a slow sip, his cold eyes fixed on the 3 men. Under the table, Coda shifted his weight, his ears turning toward the loud noise. The dog's muscles tensed, ready to spring. Aiden gently tapped the side of his leg. It was a silent command. Coda remained perfectly still, a shadow waiting in the dark. The air in the room thickened, suffocating the warmth that had been there moments before. The peaceful afternoon was entirely gone. The threat was real and immediate. The storm had just walked through the front door, and Aiden sat alone in the corner, watching every single move. The 3 men stepped fully into the diner, and the entire atmosphere of the room shifted immediately. The smell of cheap tobacco and stale sweat mixed with the comforting scent of Martha's fresh coffee, poisoning the air. True fear does not usually announce itself with a loud scream. Instead, it settles over a space like a sudden drop in temperature, freezing the breath in everyone's lungs. The few remaining local customers lowered their heads in unison. They quietly placed wrinkled cash on their tables and slid out of their booths, slipping through the front glass door without making a single sound. They knew Brody well, and they knew better than to stick around when he was looking for trouble. Brody walked toward the front counter with heavy, deliberate steps. He was a massive man, built like a solid brick wall, with a thick neck and a cruel, practiced smile. His dirty tank top clung tightly to his sweating torso, revealing faded tattoos on both arms. His 2 companions flanked him closely, like loyal attack dogs waiting for a command. One was tall and painfully thin, constantly chewing on a wooden toothpick with a bored expression. The other had a jagged, angry scar across his jaw and a nervous twitch in his right eye. Neither of them looked like they belonged in a peaceful place that served homemade cherry pie. Brody stopped directly in front of the cash register. He placed his heavy hands heavily on the clean glass countertop. Thomas stood on the other side, his frail shoulders tensed and rigid. "I asked you a question, old man," Brody said, his voice a low, threatening rumble. "Do you have our monthly contribution ready?" Thomas cleared his throat softly. He tried to stand taller, but his bad leg made him wobble slightly against the wooden cabinets. "Brody, I told you last month, business has been terribly slow lately. The new highway diverted most of our regular daily traffic. We barely made enough money to keep the lights on this week." Brody clicked his tongue against his teeth, shaking his head in exaggerated, theatrical disappointment. "Thomas, that sounds like a personal financial problem. My boys and I, we provide a very valuable service to this beautiful community. We keep things safe and secure. We ensure bad elements stay away from nice family places like this. Quality security is never free." Behind Thomas, Martha wiped her trembling hands nervously on her faded apron. Her kind eyes glistened with unshed tears. She knew exactly what Brody meant by security. He and his gang were the only real bad elements left in this town. "We just need a little more time," Thomas pleaded softly, keeping his voice respectful. "Just give us until next Friday. The holiday weekend is coming up soon. We will definitely have more customers stopping by then." In the far back booth, Aiden remained completely motionless. He did not pull out his phone to record. He did not pretend to read the laminated menu. He watched the entire interaction with cold, calculating eyes. Beneath the wooden table, Coda let out a very low, barely audible growl. The thick hair on the back of the dog's neck stood straight up. Aiden shifted his right hand under the table and rested his palm flat against Coda's warm head. He applied a gentle, firm pressure. Coda immediately stopped growling, but his amber eyes remained locked intensely on Brody's heavy leather boots. The thin man with the toothpick pointed a lazy finger directly at Thomas. "Brody does not like waiting, old man. We have a strict schedule to keep today." Brody raised a hand, silencing his partner instantly. He reached out casually and picked up a heavy white ceramic plate from a clean stack resting on the counter. He held it up to the fluorescent light, turning it slowly in his thick, calloused fingers. "This is a really nice plate," Brody said, his voice dripping with fake admiration. "Solid, well made. It would be a real terrible shame if something happened to your nice things, Thomas. Tragic accidents happen all the time to small business owners who cannot afford proper protection." "Please put that down," Martha whispered, her voice cracking with fear. "We do not want any trouble today." Brody locked his dark eyes on Martha. His cruel smile widened slightly. He simply opened his thick fingers. The heavy ceramic plate dropped straight down. It hit the hard, checkered floor and shattered into dozens of sharp, dangerous pieces. The loud crash echoed like a gunshot in the quiet diner. Martha jumped backward in terror, letting out a sharp gasp. Thomas instinctively threw his thin arms out to shield his wife from the flying white shards. Brody did not even look down at the messy floor. He leaned far over the glass counter, grabbing Thomas aggressively by the collar of his faded blue apron. He pulled the old man violently close, forcing Thomas to look directly into his angry eyes. "Listen to me very carefully," Brody whispered roughly, spit flying from his lips. "I do not care about the new highway traffic. I do not care about your expensive light bill. I care about my money. If you do not have my cash by the time I finish my business in this town today, this broken plate will be the absolute least of your worries. I will come back here tonight, and I will burn this pathetic little diner straight to the ground with you inside." Thomas breathed heavily, his wrinkled face pale with absolute, paralyzing terror. He nodded slowly, completely unable to speak. Brody shoved Thomas backward with tremendous force. The old man stumbled clumsily and fell hard against the metal kitchen shelves, knocking over a tall stack of plastic cups. Martha rushed forward frantically to help him steady himself, hot tears finally spilling down her wrinkled cheeks. Aiden watched the violent scene unfold without blinking. He saw the shiny tears on Martha's face. He saw the helpless, defeated fear in Thomas's eyes. He felt the raw tension radiating from Coda's muscular body. Yet Aiden did not stand up or shout. He took another slow, silent sip of his black coffee. He knew the exact rules of engagement. He was assessing the primary threats, identifying the leader's weaknesses, and waiting for the absolute perfect moment to strike. Brody laughed aloud, a harsh, ugly sound that filled the entire room. He turned away from the counter, his heavy boots intentionally crushing the broken pieces of the ceramic plate into the floor. He felt incredibly powerful. He felt completely in control of the room. He had no idea that a highly trained predator, far more dangerous than anyone he had ever met, was sitting quietly in the back corner, watching his every single move. Brody turned away from the terrified elderly couple. His heavy boots crunched over the shattered ceramic plate. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Fear was his favorite currency, and he had just collected a massive debt from Thomas. He cracked his knuckles, producing a loud popping sound that cut through the silence of the room. He expected to turn around and see a completely empty diner. He expected total submission from everyone in town. Instead, his dark eyes locked onto the far back corner booth. Aiden still sat there. He had not moved an inch. He held his ceramic mug, taking a slow sip of his black coffee. He looked completely unbothered by the violence that had just unfolded at the front counter. Brody narrowed his eyes. His heavy jaw clenched tightly. He did not like it when people ignored him. He hated it when people did not show immediate fear. He gestured with his thick head, signaling his two companions. The tall, thin man with the toothpick smiled lazily. The other man with the facial scar chuckled. They followed Brody as he marched slowly across the checkered floor toward the stranger. Each step Brody took sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil. He stopped directly in front of Aiden's table. He leaned his massive hands flat on the wooden surface, invading the quiet space. Aiden did not look up immediately. He carefully placed his coffee mug down on the table. "Did you lose your hearing, buddy?" Brody asked. His voice was loud, intended to echo across the entire room. "Or are you just incredibly stupid? When I do business, I expect privacy. Everyone else had the good sense to run away. Why are you still sitting here?" Aiden finally raised his eyes. They were completely cold, devoid of any emotion. He looked at Brody the way a carpenter looks at a piece of wood. He was just evaluating the material in front of him. He did not say a single word. People often mistake silence for weakness. They assume that if a man does not raise his voice, he has no power to defend himself. They believe that true strength requires a loud, aggressive display. This is a fatal miscalculation. Silence is usually the ultimate form of control. Brody snorted, clearly annoyed by the lack of response. He pulled a crumpled pack of cigarettes from his front pocket. He placed a cigarette between his lips and lit it with a cheap plastic lighter. He took a deep drag and blew a thick cloud of gray smoke directly into Aiden's face. The acrid smell of cheap tobacco filled the small corner booth. Aiden did not blink. He did not cough. He just stared right through the thick smoke, looking right through Brody. "Look at you," Brody sneered, shaking his head. He gestured at Aiden's simple black shirt and faded jeans. "You look like a drifter. A homeless loser looking for a free meal. You probably do not even have a single dollar in your pocket to pay for that coffee." The thin man with the toothpick leaned against the adjacent booth. "Maybe he is mute, Brody. Maybe the poor guy cannot speak." "Maybe he is just a coward," the scarred man added, laughing nervously at his own joke. Brody shifted his gaze downward. He finally noticed the large German shepherd resting quietly under the table. Coda lay perfectly still, but his eyes tracked Brody's heavy boots. "Well, well," Brody said, a nasty grin spreading across his face. "Look at this ugly thing. You brought a stray mutt into a clean restaurant. No wonder it smells so bad over here." Brody kicked the edge of Aiden's table with his heavy leather boot. The table shook violently. The coffee in Aiden's mug sloshed over the rim, spilling dark brown liquid onto the wooden surface. Under the table, Coda reacted. The dog did not bark, but a deep, vibrating growl erupted from his broad chest. It sounded like a heavy engine starting in the dark. Coda lifted his head, pulling his lips back to reveal sharp, bright white teeth. His muscles tensed, fully prepared to launch himself from beneath the table and tear into the man's leg. Before Coda could move, Aiden raised his right hand. He snapped his fingers exactly once. It was a sharp, crisp sound. Coda instantly stopped growling. The dog closed his mouth, lowered his head back onto his front paws, and remained completely still. His amber eyes never left Brody, but he obeyed the silent command without hesitation. Brody burst into loud, mocking laughter. He pointed a thick finger at Coda. "Look at that!" Brody yelled, turning back to look at his two friends. "The stupid dog is just like his owner, all bark and absolutely no bite. One little kick to the table and the beast cowers like a beaten puppy." The thin man spat his toothpick onto the floor and laughed along. The scarred man slapped his knee, clearly enjoying the show. They fed entirely on Brody's arrogance. In the background, standing behind the counter, Martha watched with wide, terrified eyes. She gripped her husband's arm tightly. She wanted to yell. She wanted to tell Brody to leave the poor stranger alone. She knew Aidan had nothing to do with their money problems. But Thomas held her back, shaking his head slowly. He knew that speaking up would only make Brody far angrier. Brody turned his attention back to Aidan. He leaned even closer, resting his elbows on the spilled coffee without caring. He exhaled another cloud of smoke. "You have 10 seconds to take your pathetic mutt and walk out that door," Brody threatened in a low whisper. "If you are still sitting here when I count to 10, I am going to break your jaw, and then I am going to kick your ugly dog all the way out to the highway." Aidan looked directly at Brody's face. He noted the slight widening of Brody's pupils, the uneven breathing, the poor balance caused by the heavy boots. Aidan calculated the exact distance between his right fist and Brody's throat. He calculated the time it would take to disarm the thin man and neutralize the scarred man. It would take less than 4 seconds total. But Aidan did not move. He let the silence stretch. He let Brody feel like a king. Brody chuckled, convinced he had completely dominated the stranger. He stood up straight, brushing off his dirty tank top. "That is what I thought," Brody sneered. "Just another useless coward." He turned his back on Aidan, dismissing him entirely, and began walking back toward the front counter to finish his business with the old man. Brody took heavy, arrogant steps back toward the main counter. His boots left dirty tracks on the freshly mopped floor. He felt completely victorious. He assumed the silent stranger was paralyzed by fear. Aidan watched him walk away. The moment Brody turned his back, Aidan finally moved. His right hand slid smoothly and silently into his front pocket. He extracted his smartphone. His movements were incredibly fluid and tightly controlled. He did not rush. He brought the phone up to the edge of the wooden table. He leaned the device carefully against his heavy glass of ice water. With a single tap of his thumb, he started the video recording. The camera lens pointed directly at the front counter. It perfectly framed Brody, his 2 thugs, and the elderly couple. Patience is often misunderstood as a passive trait. People assume it means sitting still, enduring abuse, and doing absolutely nothing. But true patience, the kind forged in the harsh fires of combat, is an intensely active state. It is the silent, deliberate gathering of critical information. It is a coiled spring, locking its mechanisms into place, waiting for the exact necessary moment to release its stored energy. Aidan possessed this dangerous kind of patience. He knew that physical force without undeniable justification often leads to complicated legal trouble. He needed absolute, irrefutable proof of the extortion and the assault. He needed Brody to dig his own grave so deep that no expensive lawyer could ever pull him out. Brody slapped his heavy palm on the glass counter again, startling the elderly couple. "Open the drawer, Thomas," Brody commanded loudly. "We are completely out of time." Thomas moved slowly. His calloused hands shook violently as he reached for the register key in his pocket. He fumbled with the metal ring. The slight delay infuriated the gang leader. The scarred man laughed from his position near the door. "The old guy forgot how to open his own cash box. Maybe we should open his head instead." Martha could no longer hide behind her husband. The heavy fear inside her chest suddenly transformed into a desperate kind of courage. She stepped out from the narrow kitchen space. She moved around the counter and stood directly between Brody and her husband. Her apron was covered in flour and spilled tea, but she stood as tall as her frail frame allowed. "Please, Brody," Martha pleaded. Her voice shook, but it echoed surprisingly loud across the empty diner. "We will give you the money. We will give you everything in the drawer. Just leave us alone. And please, leave that poor man in the corner out of this. He is just a tired traveler. He has absolutely nothing to do with our problems." Brody stopped tapping his fingers. He looked down at Martha as if she were a bothersome insect. He hated when victims tried to negotiate. He despised it when they showed any sudden sign of bravery. He slowly turned his thick neck and looked back at Aidan, who was still sitting quietly in the booth. "You care about the drifter?" Brody asked softly. His voice carried a sharp, dangerous edge. "You think you are in a position to protect someone else right now?" "He is a guest in our diner," Martha insisted, standing her ground. "You have no right to treat him that way." Brody's face flushed bright red. The thick veins in his neck bulged against his skin. He raised his right arm and swung it backward, aggressively slapping Martha's hand away from the counter. The impact was loud and cruel. Martha stumbled sideways. She caught herself on a metal chair, gasping in sudden pain as she clutched her bruised wrist. "Do not ever tell me what I have a right to do in this town," Brody yelled. Thomas cried out and rushed to his wife. He wrapped his thin arms around her trembling shoulders, inspecting her rapidly swelling wrist. Tears streamed down his wrinkled face. He felt utterly powerless. He had worked his entire life to build this small diner, to provide a safe place for his family, and now he had to watch a local thug destroy it piece by piece. Brody was not finished. His anger needed a bigger target. He spun around and stomped back toward Aiden's booth. The wooden floorboards groaned under his heavy weight. The thin man with the toothpick stepped forward, ready to jump in if the stranger decided to fight back. The scarred man cracked his knuckles, a sick smile spreading across his face. They loved this part. They loved breaking people down. Aiden sat perfectly still. The phone camera continued to record every single frame of the escalating violence. Under the table, Coda remained in his exact position, though the dog's breathing grew deeper and faster. Brody stopped at the edge of the table. He looked down at Aiden with pure, unadulterated hatred. "She thinks you are a guest," Brody snarled. He leaned close enough that Aiden could smell the stale beer and cheap tobacco on his breath. "I think you are a disease. I think you are a pathetic piece of trash who does not know when to run away." Brody raised his heavy hand and violently swiped at the table. He struck Aiden's ceramic coffee mug. The heavy cup flew off the table and crashed against the adjacent wall. Hot black coffee sprayed everywhere. A large splash of the dark liquid hit Aiden's chest, soaking directly through his simple black shirt. The rest of the coffee pooled on the wooden table and began dripping steadily onto the floor, splashing near Coda's paws. Aiden did not wipe the hot coffee from his chest. He did not flinch when the boiling liquid seeped through his cotton shirt and burned his skin. His military training had taught him to compartmentalize pain. Pain was just data. It was information telling him his body was still functioning. It did not require an emotional response. The diner fell completely silent. The heat inside the room felt oppressive. Every second stretched into a painful eternity. The only sound was the steady drip of the spilled coffee hitting the checkered linoleum floor. Brody leaned forward, placing both of his massive hands flat on the wet table. He pushed his face just inches away from Aiden. "Stand up," Brody whispered viciously. "I dare you. Stand up and do something about it. Show me you are a real man, or sit there and wear my mess like the coward you are." Aiden looked at his ruined shirt. He looked at the shattered mug on the floor. Then he raised his cold, calculating eyes to meet Brody's furious stare. He still did not say a single word. He was waiting for the final piece of the puzzle. He was waiting for the exact moment the trap would spring completely shut. Brody smiled a wide, ugly smile. He stood over Aiden for another few seconds, soaking in the silence. He genuinely believed he had broken the man's spirit completely. The spilled coffee dripped rhythmically from the edge of the table onto the floor. It was the only sound in the tense corner of the diner. To Brody, that silence meant total submission. He turned his broad back to the booth. He did not give the stranger or the dog another thought. Brody walked heavily toward the front counter again. His two companions, the thin man with the toothpick and the scarred man, laughed loudly. They praised Brody for his quick handling of the situation. They fed his massive ego with every word. Brody adjusted his dirty tank top and approached the glass counter where Thomas and Martha stood terrified. Sometimes, A person's greatest weakness is their absolute certainty of their own power. Bullies rely on fear to control a room, but they fail to understand that genuine danger rarely makes a loud noise before it strikes. The loudest person in the room is almost never the most dangerous one. Brody slammed his heavy palm on the glass one more time. The remaining intact plates rattled loudly on the shelves behind the counter. "All right, Thomas," Brody said. His voice was rough and deeply impatient. "Playtime is officially over. The drifter got his lesson. Now you are going to get yours if you do not open that register right now. Hand over the cash." Thomas looked at his wife. Martha stood clutching her bruised wrist, tears still falling down her pale cheeks. The old man knew they had less than $50 in the drawer. He knew it would not satisfy Brody. He also knew that if he gave up the money, they would not be able to buy groceries for themselves tomorrow. But he saw the violent intent in Brody's dark eyes. Thomas reached into his faded apron pocket with trembling fingers. He pulled out a small brass key. His hand shook so badly he dropped the key. It hit the checkered floor with a sharp clink and slid out of reach under the wooden cabinets. "Are you kidding me?" Brody yelled. His face turned a deep, angry red. "You stupid, clumsy old man." Brody did not wait for Thomas to bend down. He reached over the glass counter with both massive arms. He grabbed the heavy metal cash register and yanked it violently forward. The wires ripped out of the wall socket, sending a brief spark of electricity into the warm air. Brody slammed the heavy machine onto the front of the counter, cracking the glass beneath it. "I will open it myself," Brody growled. Thomas panicked. That register held their entire livelihood. Without thinking about the severe danger, the frail old man lunged forward. He threw his thin arms over the metal box, using his own body weight to protect it. "No!" Thomas cried out. "Please, Brody, do not do this. It is all we have left." "Get off it, old man," Brody shouted. In the back corner booth, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Aiden's phone was still recording quietly, propped perfectly against his water glass. The camera captured Brody destroying property and aggressively threatening the elderly couple. The solid evidence of extortion and property damage was now undeniable. Aiden finally had the legal justification he needed. Under the table, Coda felt the immediate shift in his handler. The large German shepherd let out another low, vibrating growl. The dog's thick muscles coiled tight like heavy steel springs. His paws gripped the linoleum floor firmly. He was ready to launch. He just needed the final command. Aiden moved. He did not stand up quickly. He did not shout a loud warning. He rose from the booth with terrifying smoothness. Every single movement was perfectly calculated and completely silent. He stood to his full height. The hot coffee soaked into his black shirt did not bother him at all. His eyes locked onto the back of Brody's thick neck. The distance was exactly 22 feet. The thin man with the toothpick saw Aiden stand up. The thug's lazy smile vanished instantly. He opened his mouth to warn Brody, but the words caught in his dry throat. There was something fundamentally horrifying about the cold, dead expression on Aiden's face. The thin man instinctively took a slow step backward toward the front door. Brody did not notice his friend backing away. He was entirely focused on the cash register and the stubborn old man trying to protect it. "I said let go," Brody roared. He grabbed Thomas by the shoulders of his apron. He lifted the elderly man easily, pulling his feet completely off the floor. Thomas gasped in sudden pain as Brody's thick fingers dug deeply into his frail collarbones. Martha screamed in absolute terror. She tried to grab Brody's heavy arm, but he kicked her away forcefully. Martha fell hard onto the floor, crying out for someone to help them. Brody pulled his right fist back. His thick knuckles were heavily scarred from years of street fights. He aimed directly for Thomas's fragile face. He put his entire body weight into the incoming strike. He intended to knock the old man unconscious and take the money by force. The final straw had officially snapped. The thin line between patience and action dissolved completely. Aiden did not walk. He exploded forward. He covered the 22 feet in 3 massive silent strides. His heavy boots barely made a sound on the linoleum. He closed the distance with the terrifying speed of a striking snake. His mind processed the entire environment in fractions of a second. The scarred man was to his right, currently reaching for a heavy glass ketchup bottle on a nearby table. The thin man was near the door, visibly hesitating and frozen in fear. Brody was completely exposed, his back turned, his thick arm drawn back to deliver a devastating punch to the helpless old diner owner. Aiden knew that if that punch landed, Thomas might not survive the blunt impact. The elderly man's bones were simply too fragile. The blunt force would be fatal. Aiden reached the front counter precisely as Brody's massive fist began to travel forward. He did not announce his presence. He let his violent actions speak for him. The long time for quiet observation had ended. The time for total neutralization had arrived. Brody's heavy fist flew toward Thomas's face. Martha screamed one last desperate time from the floor. But the punch never connected. The air inside the diner felt thick, suffocating everyone present. Brody's heavy fist traveled through the space between himself and the elderly man. He put his entire weight behind the punch. He expected the sickening feeling of bone giving way under his heavy knuckles. He anticipated the absolute power of breaking someone down. Instead, his wrist hit something solid. It felt exactly like striking an iron bar. Aiden did not simply block the incoming punch. He intercepted it with mathematical precision. His left hand clamped tightly around Brody's thick wrist like a mechanical vise. The forward momentum of the violent strike belonged entirely to Brody, but Aiden immediately took control of the direction. He stepped smoothly to the outside, twisted his hips slightly, and pulled Brody forward, using the much heavier man's own raw force directly against him. Brody's dark eyes widened in sudden, jarring confusion. He tried to pull his arm back, planting his heavy boots, but the grip on his wrist was unbreakable. Aiden drove the heel of his right palm hard into the side of Brody's elbow joint. He did not strike to break the bone. He struck to completely paralyze the radial nerve. Brody let out a sharp, breathless gasp as his entire arm went completely numb. The thick muscles in his limb failed instantly. Before Brody could throw his other fist or attempt to recover his balance, Aiden pivoted sharply on his heel. He swept his heavy tactical boot directly behind Brody's right leg and pushed firmly downward. Brody hit the checkered linoleum floor hard. The heavy impact shook the entire diner, rattling the pie cases and the clean mugs on the back counter. Aiden moved with the practiced, terrifying fluidity of thousands of hours of repetitive combat drills. He dropped his right knee firmly into the center of Brody's back, right between the shoulder blades, pinning him to the floor. He pulled the numb arm back and locked it tightly against the joint, isolating the shoulder. Brody screamed. It was not a yell of anger or defiance. It was a high, panicked shriek of absolute pain and shock. Thomas stumbled backward against the wooden kitchen cabinets, breathing heavily, completely unharmed. Martha rushed to her husband's side, pulling him away from the violence, her eyes wide with disbelief. The scarred man near the front door finally snapped out of his frozen state. He realized his boss was pinned on the ground. He grabbed a heavy glass ketchup bottle from the nearest wooden table. He raised it high above his head, letting out a loud, angry shout, and charged forward, intending to hit Aiden directly in the back of the head. Aiden did not even turn around to face the incoming threat. He kept his knee planted firmly on Brody's back. He simply spoke a single, sharp command. "Coda, strike." Under the back booth, the heavy steel spring finally released. Coda exploded from the shadows. The large German shepherd covered the distance across the diner in less than 2 seconds. His strong paws found perfect traction on the linoleum. Coda did not hesitate. He did not stop to bark. He launched his entire 80-pound body directly at the charging scarred man. The thug barely had time to register the dark blur flying toward him. Coda hit him squarely in the chest. The massive kinetic energy knocked the breath entirely out of the man's lungs. He flew backward, dropping the heavy glass bottle. The bottle shattered loudly on the floor, splashing red ketchup across the white tiles. The man crashed hard onto his back, his head bouncing lightly against the floorboards. Coda landed perfectly on top of him. The dog planted his heavy front paws firmly on the man's shoulders, pinning him to the ground with brutal efficiency. Coda lowered his large head. He pulled his dark lips back, exposing his bright white teeth mere inches from the man's exposed throat. A terrifying, vibrating growl ripped from the dog's deep chest. It was a sound that promised immediate and violent consequences if the man dared to move a single muscle. The scarred man went entirely rigid. He squeezed his eyes shut and held his empty hands up in total surrender, whimpering softly in pure terror. The fundamental difference between a street brawler and a highly trained operative is not anger. It is the complete absence of it. A street thug fights to inflict cruelty, to intimidate, and to satisfy his own fragile ego. A trained soldier fights merely to neutralize a designated threat, using absolute precision and wasting absolutely no energy. Aiden displayed no rage. He simply solved a dangerous physical equation in a matter of seconds. The thin man with the toothpick stood frozen by the front door. He watched his powerful boss screaming on the floor under the knee of a stranger. He watched his violent friend whimpering under the heavy paws of a vicious attack dog. The thin man slowly reached into his front pocket. He carried a small folding knife, and his trembling fingers brushed against the metal handle. He thought about drawing it. Aiden finally turned his head. He locked his cold, calculating eyes directly onto the thin man. He applied a fraction of an inch more pressure to Brody's pinned arm. Brody screamed much louder, begging frantically for the pain to stop. "Take it out," Aiden said softly to the thin man. His deep voice cut through the diner with chilling clarity. "Draw the knife. Let us see what happens next." The thin man froze completely. His hand trembled inside his denim pocket. He looked at Aiden's completely calm, emotionless face. He looked at Coda, whose amber eyes shifted momentarily to assess the potential new target. The thin man slowly pulled his empty hand out of his pocket, leaving the knife behind. He raised both of his hands slowly into the air, took 2 cautious steps backward, and pressed his back firmly against the glass of the front door. He wanted absolutely no part of this fight. The entire physical altercation took exactly 6 seconds. The dusty diner, previously filled with loud threats and terrifying violence, fell into a heavy, unbroken silence. The only sounds were Brody's pained groans and Coda's steady, rumbling growl. Aiden maintained his perfect joint lock. He checked the room one more time, ensuring the scene was completely secure. He had neutralized 3 violent men, protected the innocent owners, and preserved all the digital evidence without breaking a single sweat. Thomas and Martha held on to each other behind the counter. They stared at the tall stranger in the coffee-stained black shirt. They had prayed for a miracle to save them from Brody's cruelty, but they never expected it to arrive in the form of a quiet man and his fiercely loyal dog. The piercing wail of police sirens shattered the heavy silence inside the diner. Red and blue lights flashed brightly through the dusty front windows, painting the walls in sharp, frantic colors. 2 patrol vehicles skidded to a halt in the gravel parking lot outside. Doors slammed loudly. 2 local deputies rushed through the front entrance with their hands resting securely on their duty belts. They stopped immediately upon seeing the chaotic scene. Broken plates littered the floor. A massive man lay pinned to the linoleum under the knee of a stranger. Another man lay trapped beneath a large, snarling German shepherd. An elderly couple huddled together behind the cracked glass counter. "Nobody move!" the lead deputy shouted. His eyes darted around the room, trying to assess the immediate threats. "Keep your hands where I can see them!" Brody immediately started shouting from his position on the floor. He twisted his face into a mask of fake agony, trying to play the innocent victim. "Officers, help us!" Brody yelled, his voice cracking dramatically. "This crazy drifter attacked us for absolutely no reason. We just stopped in for a piece of pie, and he went completely insane. He broke my arm. The dog tried to kill my friend." The scarred man whimpered loudly in agreement, afraid to move his head while Coda kept his sharp teeth inches from his throat. The thin man stood frozen by the door, raising his hands higher into the air. Aiden did not argue. He did not raise his voice to defend himself against the obvious lies. He looked calmly at the lead deputy. "Coda, heel!" Aiden commanded softly. The German shepherd immediately stepped off the scarred man. Coda trotted over to Aiden and sat calmly by his side, his duty complete. Aiden slowly lifted his knee off Brody's back. He stood up straight, keeping his empty hands visible at his sides. He moved with slow, deliberate precision to show the officers he meant no harm. "Step back from the men," the deputy ordered, drawing his handcuffs. Aiden took 3 slow steps backward. He pointed a steady finger toward the back booth where his coffee had spilled earlier. "Officers," Aiden said clearly, "my phone is resting on that back table. It has been recording video for the last 15 minutes. You will find all the answers you need right there." The second deputy walked cautiously over to the booth. He picked up the smartphone and tapped the screen. He watched the footage in silence. He watched Brody demand extortion money. He watched the ceramic plate shatter on the floor. He watched Brody threaten to burn the building down. He watched Brody grab Thomas by the collar and attempt a violent assault. The evidence was crystal clear and completely undeniable. The deputy walked back to his partner and nodded firmly. He handed over the phone. "Save the lies for the judge, Brody," the lead deputy said, grabbing the large man by his uninjured arm and pulling him roughly to his feet. "You have been a major problem in this town for far too long. This time, you're going away for a long stretch." The officers quickly secured metal handcuffs around the wrists of all 3 men. Brody glared at Aiden with pure hatred, but the fight had completely left his body. The police marched the thugs out the front door and shoved them into the back of the patrol cruisers. The engines roared to life, and the cars pulled away, taking the violence and fear with them. The diner felt empty again, but the oppressive atmosphere had completely vanished. The ceiling fans pushed cool air through the room. The danger was entirely gone. Thomas bent down with trembling hands to pick up a shattered piece of ceramic. He dropped it instantly, lacking the strength to hold it. Aiden walked over to the corner, grabbed a wooden broom, and approached the counter. "Let me help you with that, sir," he said quietly. He began sweeping the broken glass and spilled ketchup into a neat pile. Martha watched him. Her heart still raced in her chest. She looked at this strange, quiet man who had just dismantled a local gang in a matter of seconds. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaking with residual fear and deep gratitude. "Why did you step in to help us?" Aiden stopped sweeping. He leaned the broom against the counter. He reached his right hand deep into his front pocket. He did not pull out a wallet or a badge. He pulled out a worn metal chain. 2 silver dog tags hung from the very end of it. The metal clinked softly as he gently placed the tags onto the cracked glass counter. Thomas and Martha stepped closer. They looked down at the stamped metal. They recognized the name immediately. "My name is Aiden," he said softly, his cold eyes finally warming with genuine emotion. "I served with your son, Michael, in the special operation teams." Martha covered her mouth with both hands. A fresh wave of hot tears spilled down her wrinkled cheeks. Thomas grabbed the edge of the counter to steady himself, staring blankly at his son's metal tags. "Michael was the bravest man I ever knew," Aiden continued, his voice thick with memory. "We spent countless nights in the desert talking about this place. He talked about your famous cherry pie, Martha. He talked about how incredibly hard you worked your entire life, Thomas. He loved you both more than anything in this world. Sometimes the hardest battles are not fought with physical strikes, but with the heavy memories of those left behind." Aiden carried the weight of that profound memory every single day since his teammate fell. Aiden looked down at his boots, then back at the elderly couple. "Before we went out on our final operation, Michael asked me for a personal favor. He knew the risks. He asked me to check on you if he did not make it back. He wanted to make sure you were safe. He entrusted your family to me." Aiden reached down and placed a hand on Coda's broad head. "Coda was his partner first. We came here today to fulfill that promise. I just did not expect to find you in so much trouble. I am very glad we arrived exactly when we did." Thomas reached out with a trembling, calloused hand. He picked up the silver dog tags and pressed them tightly against his chest. He closed his eyes, weeping silently for the brave boy he had lost. Martha stepped out from behind the counter. She did not hesitate. She wrapped her frail arms tightly around Aiden's broad shoulders, burying her face against his coffee-stained shirt, crying tears of sorrow and ultimate relief. The red and blue lights of the patrol cars faded into the distance. The loud sirens grew quiet, swallowed entirely by the vast open Texas landscape. Inside the diner, the heavy atmosphere of the violent afternoon finally lifted completely. The ceiling fans continued their slow, steady rotation, pushing cool air through the room. Thomas walked over to the front door. His hands still shook slightly, but his movements carried a new sense of profound relief. He reached up and turned the small plastic sign in the window from open to closed. He twisted the heavy deadbolt lock until it clicked securely. The diner belonged entirely to them again. Martha wiped her tear-stained face with her faded apron. She looked at Aiden, who stood quietly near the front counter. The dark coffee stain on his black shirt was completely dry now, leaving a stiff, rigid patch on the fabric. Beside him, Coda sat perfectly still, his amber eyes watching the elderly couple with gentle curiosity. "You are not going anywhere tonight," Martha said. Her voice was soft but carried absolute authority. "You saved our lives today, Aiden, and you brought our boy back to us in the only way you could. You are staying right here for dinner." Aiden nodded slowly. He did not argue. He knew that sharing a meal was the final step in fulfilling his solemn promise to Michael. It was the absolute least he could do. Thomas walked behind the counter and turned off the overhead fluorescent lights. He left only the warm, yellow pendant lamps illuminating the dining area. The softer light instantly transformed the room from a chaotic crime scene back into a comforting family home. He limped into the narrow kitchen, pulling fresh ingredients from the heavy refrigerator. Aiden sat down at a clean booth near the center of the room. Coda immediately crawled under the table and rested his large head on his paws, letting out a long, contented sigh. The dog knew the mission was over. The perimeter was secure. It was finally time to rest. For the next hour, the diner filled with the comforting sounds of cooking. Meat sizzled loudly on the hot flat-iron grill. Fresh potatoes fried in hot oil. The rich smell of savory gravy completely masked the lingering odor of Brody's cheap tobacco. Sometimes the quietest moments following a violent storm carry the most profound weight. This is not just because the immediate danger is gone, but because the empty space the fear leaves behind is finally filled with genuine human connection. The quiet diner was no longer just a place of business. It became a sanctuary for healing. Martha brought out heavy ceramic plates filled with thick cuts of steak, roasted potatoes, and steamed vegetables. She placed a massive portion of unseasoned meat in a separate steel bowl and set it gently on the floor for Coda. The German shepherd looked up at Aiden, waiting patiently for the silent command. Aiden gave a subtle nod. Coda immediately began eating, his tail wagging softly against the checkered linoleum floor. Thomas sat across from Aiden. He poured 3 large glasses of sweet iced tea. The old man looked deeply at the silver dog tags resting near Aiden's glass. "Michael wrote to us about you," Thomas said quietly. His voice carried a mixture of deep sorrow and immense pride. "He said you were the most disciplined soldier in the entire unit. He said you never panicked, no matter how bad things got out there." Aiden looked down at his glass. "Michael was the heart of the team, sir. He kept our spirits up. He reminded us what we were actually fighting for back home. He talked about this diner every single day. He talked about your cherry pie so much that the rest of the guys started dreaming about it." Martha smiled warmly. Fresh tears pooled in the corners of her kind eyes. "I baked a fresh pie just this morning. It is waiting for us in the kitchen." They ate the heavy meal in comfortable silence. The initial shock of the afternoon violence slowly washed away, replaced by the deep, healing comfort of shared grief and mutual respect. They did not talk about Brody. They did not discuss the police or the broken plates. They only talked about Michael. Aidan shared detailed stories from their training days. He told Thomas and Martha about the time Michael accidentally dropped his heavy gear into a muddy river and had to chase it downstream for a mile. He told them about Michael's incredible bravery during their toughest deployments overseas. With every story, the heavy burden of loss in the room felt a little lighter. The sun began to set outside the dusty windows. The sky turned a brilliant shade of deep orange and purple. The golden hour light spilled across the wooden tables, bathing the entire room in a warm, peaceful glow. Martha finished her meal and reached under the table. Coda lifted his large head and placed his chin gently onto Martha's lap. The elderly woman softly stroked the dog's thick black and tan fur. Coda closed his eyes, soaking in the absolute affection. Aidan watched the interaction. He felt the heavy knot of tension in his chest finally loosen. He had carried the massive weight of his promise for over a year. He had traveled hundreds of miles to find this small town. He had faced down violent local thugs to protect the people his teammate loved the most. Now, looking at the peaceful faces of Thomas and Martha, Aidan knew the mission was truly complete. He reached out and picked up the silver dog tags. The cold metal felt different in his hand now. It did not feel like a heavy burden anymore. It felt like a symbol of absolute closure. Thomas reached across the table and placed his rough, calloused hand over Aidan's hand. "Thank you, son," Thomas whispered sincerely. "Thank you for looking out for him over there. And thank you for looking out for us today. You will always have a safe place at this table." Aidan looked at the old man. The cold, calculating look in his eyes was completely gone, replaced by a deep, quiet peace. "It was my honor, sir," Aidan replied softly. "It was my absolute honor." Outside, the rural Texas evening settled over the small town. The shadows grew longer, but the diner remained a beacon of warmth and safety. A silent warrior and his faithful dog had brought justice to a quiet corner of the world, and in doing so, they had finally found peace for themselves. True strength is rarely loud. It does not need to shout to be heard or throw the first punch to prove its power. The story of Aidan, Coda, and the elderly couple reminds us that genuine courage lies in patience, discipline, and the willingness to protect those who cannot protect themselves. I always find myself deeply moved by stories like this because they show us that our promises to the people we love can transcend even the greatest loss. Heroes do not always wear capes or demand attention. Sometimes they sit quietly in the corner of a dusty diner, waiting for the exact moment to step up and do what is right. May God bless you with the same quiet strength, and may He always place faithful guardians in your path when you need them the most. If you believe in the power of a kept promise and the loyalty of a good dog, please comment "Amen" down below. If this story touched your heart, I would be so grateful if you could like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing you more inspiring stories about the beautiful bond between humans and animals.